Hello, everyone. My name is Mark. This is basically a comparison video of the Minkov-Kaasa studies with the Hofstede studies. So the first question asked us to graph um, our country of research with our home country. I was not really able to get a lot of data for Uganda, so I had to use Kenya. Uganda's data is only available for later dimensions like long-term orientation and indulgence versus restraint, which I clearly stated in the Word document that I uploaded in the Module 5 discussion. So this video is basically going to be doing comparison score between the Hofstede and the Minkov-Kaasa studies and how exactly they differ. When Hofstede was doing his country dimensions, he didn't really have a lot of data available to him compared to the Minkov and Kaasa studies. And then Hofstede's individualism dimension didn't really cover as much information as the Minkov and Kaasa studies. Hofstede describes individualism as having loose ties and connections with people and being independent of oneself. The Minkov and Kaasa studies dive deeper into this explanation of individualism and collectivism using the in-group and out-group. So, in-group favoritism and out-group exclusionism. So if you're part of an in-group, let's say if you're in a country and your tribe or your religion is the majority, and you're in a setting where the very tribe or the religious group that you belong to is the majority in that very setting, that's basically what I would describe as in-group favoritism, because you're in the in-group, okay? So let's say Brazil as a country is Roman Catholic, and you're in a setting where they're mostly Catholics. It's going to be easier for you to understand some of the nuances of what's going on, because everybody knows that, we're a Roman Catholic country. But if it was a Muslim or a Hindu that was in that kind of setting, they would not be able to get in, because they have culture differences. Now, Minkov and Kaasa look at things from an objective point of view, while Hofstede looks at it from a subjective point of view. Now, the objective point of view has to do with things like transparency, corruption, emancipation, and basically the tangible, observable practices and behaviors in a society. When you look at the subjective part of things that Hofstede usually used in his research, you're going to have things like values, beliefs, attitudes, and perceptions that individuals hold within a society. So the difference between the Minkov studies, Minkov-Kaasa and Hofstede studies, is that Minkov and Kaasa tried to incorporate a more objective view of some of the dimensions, and they were able to break down the individualism, collectivism dimension of Hofstede into a much more detailed analysis. And also, Minkov was able to expound upon his flex humility and monumentalism dimension with a long-term orientation. Now, Brazil, as a country, when you go through the book, the Hofstede book, Brazil is not very long-term oriented. They have a very short-term orientation, and their propensity for high indulgence is very, very high. Now, when it comes to individualism, collectivism, Brazil has a score of 56, and flex humility, monumentalism is 83. So Brazil is more on the collectivist, monumentalist side of things. When you look at a monumentalist culture, it's more of do as you please, high self-esteem and contentedness, exchange, and generosity. Now, the exchange and generosity part, if you looked at my first upload of the Hofstede Dimensional Studies of Brazil, in Brazilian work culture, if you're trying to appreciate a colleague or a business partner, they usually do it by taking out someone for lunch or inviting someone for a dinner party. And this ties into exchange and generosity. Now, the reason as to why the Minkov and Kaasa studies are much more detailed is because of the amount of data that was available. When you look at the book that we're reading for class, when it comes to long-term orientation, if you look at it from the Chinese value survey perspective, Brazil ranks at 6 and has a score of 65. But the later World Value Survey that incorporated many more countries and much more data gives Brazil a rank of 49 and a score of 45. Now, this basically goes to show you that the later studies of dimensions that were done for countries are much more accurate. Why is it that Brazil has a score of 6 in the Chinese Value Survey? Has a rank of 6 in the Chinese Value Survey and a rank of 49 in the World Value Survey. The reason for these differences in rank is because a lot more data was available and a lot more countries were included. So when you have a lot more countries included in the study, some of the scores they're not gonna be the same, because when you have a lot more players in the field, there's going to be a lot more competition and there's going to be a lot more differences involved. So that's the reason as to why the Minkov and Kaasa studies are a much better way of looking at some of the dimensions of the Hofstede studies. Now, there's some conceptual differences between Minkov and Kaasa and Hofstede, and it has to do with the individualism and collectivism dimension. Like I said before, in-group favoritism and out-group exclusionism. And then the second difference is it updated the version considering cultural difference between rich and developing countries. The Minkov and Kaasa studies included a lot more countries than the Hofstede studies. Now, Brazil is seen as, like I said, short-term orientation, more of monumentalism and collectivism. So in a collectivist culture, when it comes to things like communication, it's usually going to be indirect, and there's going to be a lot of non-verbal communication. There's also going to be respect for authority figures and basically a hierarchy. Brazil has a very high power distance. Brazil has a high power distance score of about 69, and then their individualism collectivism score from the Hofstede studies stands at 36. Now, 36 is a pretty low score for an individualist country. Brazil is a collectivist country, like I've said before. Now, in a collectivist society, things are not done per se for the individual. People do things in a group setting. We're doing this for the betterment of the group. So like maybe your family or maybe the community that you come from, compared to an individualistic society where people basically work for themselves and it's every month for himself. Like basically you're just basically going along to get along, which is a much bigger difference from the collectivist cultures. Now, short-term orientation monumentalist cultures create networks of economically interdependent people. The key word here is interdependence. When you have a society that doesn't plan long-term, is more about the bottom line, and with more of the monumentalist values, you're going to have encouraged positive feelings of strong self-esteem and pride. Brazil as a country has a very, very nationalistic culture. And I think we can all see that when they're playing, especially during World Cup. When it comes to their football, Brazilians love their country. I think they're they're very nationalistic when it comes to the love for Brazil. And this is what makes them more of them on the monumentalist side and short term. If you have an overzeal and love for your country and you don't consider other people's cultures, you're not going to be able to plan long term. Long term cultures usually think about the unexpected, the unknown. So if we're going to compete, how are we going to be able to access certain resources? Because Brazil as a country cannot have everything that they need. There's no country in this world that has every resource that it needs. You're going to have to do trade with another country. So if you're thinking short term, some of these data is not going to come to you. You're going to be like, oh, I love my country and I'm not about those other people out there. So it's all about Brazil. It's all about my country. It's all about our culture. A society that has this kind of thinking is going to be very, very short term oriented. And then I want to talk about, I want to expound on monumentalism. High self esteem and contentedness. This also drives into their work culture in both motivation, communication, and group work, basically teamwork. Now, when you're dealing with a country like Brazil, when it comes to communication, like we said before, communication is mostly indirect, context dependent, nonverbal cues, respect for hierarchy, and collectivist values. When it comes to motivation, intrinsic rewards, and then it's more about community and relationships. Most Brazilians get motivation from their family members or the communities that they stay in. And then teamwork in Brazil, there has to be respect for authority. It's not really laissez-faire where we're all in this together and there's no differences in. There has to be respect for authority. That's the first thing that you have to get into your head when it comes to collectivist cultures. And then nonverbal communication. And with nonverbal communication comes the ability to interpret some of the nonverbal signals and signs. So if you're in a Brazilian work setting, you have to know when the boss is trying to let you know that the meeting has to end. He's not going to tell it to you directly, but you could see from his nonverbal cues. Maybe he could start checking his phone, or maybe you could maybe tap one of. I don't know how they do it in Brazil, but there's a lot of need for the wisdom and understanding of interpreting non-verbal communication. Now, the new scores for Brazil from the Minkov-Kaasa studies. Individualism versus collectivism came at minus 56, and then the flex humility, monumentalism at minus 83. So back to my point, Brazil scores more on the collectivist, monumentalist side. And then the Minkov and Kaasa studies try to incorporate more of the societal elements. So on the societal elements, I try to look at mostly gender-based relationships and the political sphere and the business sphere. Brazil is a very high power distance country, which means that, and also when it comes to their gender relations, when you look at data by Statista, a lot of men still dominate most of the powerful positions in Brazil, and women don't really have a say in much of the, top level management of most companies. A man is still seen as the head of the home in Brazil, and generally men in society are much more respected in Brazil. There's a 64% prevalence for gender violence and a 49% femicide rate. So basically, these scores are basically not surprising for a country with a high masculinity, low feminine, context. And then women's rights. There's very low opportunities for women to get into the political and business sphere. Yes, there are women in Brazil that are powerful, that are running businesses. But when you look at the proportion of women and men in these powerful positions, the men still number the women. And then political freedom. Women in Brazil are still very poorly represented. There has to be a lot more done to represent women's issues and, concerns for women in Brazil. When you look at the Minkov and Kaasa studies, the article that was sent to us for Module 5, I think, if you look at their emancipation and orientation. Brazil basically has a very low emancipation rate. So emancipation is basically a society's tendency to give people their freedom and their political, social, and religious rights. So the reason that's why Brazil scores low on their gender index is because of the low emancipation and short-term orientation. A society that thinks long-term understands that women and men have to play on the same equal footing. If you have only men in certain positions, there are certain things that you might have to sell to the opposite gender that you might not understand. So, and it's just like President Barack Obama said, when you have a football team and you substitute half the team, okay, how do you expect to compete with another football team that plays all its members? So this goes back to the concept of, relations between gender and also race and religion. If you have a country that favors half of its population over the other half, how do you expect the country to compete with another country that actually plays fair game? It's going to be hard. It's going to be very, very hard. So I just want to conclude by saying the Minkov and Kaasa studies really did a really good job trying to dive deeper into some of the societal issues, things like wealth and GNI per capita index. It looked at things like the cool water effect. So many intricate differences that the Hofstede studies didn't really dive into. And this is the reason as to why I think the Minkov and Kaasa studies and later studies is a much better way to compare countries in these different dimensions. Thank you.